So, Tahir, great to see you. Thanks for joining today. And if you could tell people who don't know your work a little bit about yourself and about I-MAK, that would be great.
Yeah, Matt, thanks for having me, and it's a pleasure to see you again. So, the Initiative for Medicine's Access to Knowledge, I-MAK, as the acronym goes, is an organization that works at the intersection of the area of intellectual property law and medicines. So, basically, how does the intellectual property system impact the ability for folk to be able to access their medicines in an affordable manner, but also how the intellectual property system incentivizes and drives what kind of medicines we get and what's invested in. So we really look at the whole, we call it the medicine system, from sort of R&D right through to supply and access. And our goal is to build a more just and equitable medicine system, and really trying to reform aspects where the intellectual property system, we believe, particularly patents, that's where our focus really is, how it impacts the ability to uh, get people the medicines they need at a price that is affordable, because patents, as we'll show in this discussion, give so much power in many different ways, and allows certain individuals or a few individuals to dictate what the market looks like and who gets ability to access them.
What led you to this work? How'd you start thinking about patents and medicine?
Well, I come, and I jokingly say this, I come from the dark side, which was I was actually an intellectual property lawyer in my early career. I worked in the commercial side of it. That's where I qualified, and that's where I practiced in for a good 10 years. And so I focused on what I would call a lot of the soft areas of intellectual property, which is mostly copyright, trademarks, designs. I did do some patent work, and then basically that really taught me how the whole system works. And as I learned to understand it more and more, I also saw what I call where I now understand the practices that lawyers and corporations use, or even individuals, to basically extract more from the system as it is, for their own benefit, for their own profitability, motivations, and also just even being active for big corporations, and steamrolling smaller organizations or smaller individual traders, and basically because we didn't have a legal case, but we had the deep pockets to do so. And so it was all that really made me sort of reconsider. And I think it was at a time when the World Trade Organization had just been born, 1995, 96.
Okay.
And some of you may remember sort of Battle of Seattle and all that stuff. And I was still very much sort of, to use a British phrase, wet behind the ears on all that. I didn't really have a human rights lens or a social justice lens. I was very much corporate. And from my side as a practicing attorney, I thought this is great. You know, we get this kind of more harmonized international intellectual property system. Many countries in global south didn't want this, and we can get into that maybe later in the discussion. But I started to learn more about it, and I thought, this is interesting. And it was at that point then, as I started to learn more about the what I call the flaws in the system, that I started to question why I wanted to do this work, and whether I could, even from a kind of professional conduct point of view,
Hmm.
because there were times when we were basically trying to sort of railroad people into sort of agreements which we really had no right to. You know, cease and desist letters, where you send a letter to prevent someone from doing something when you really had no legal basis, but you had the power and the clout. So the combination of both, and then also just shaping the laws to how you want them to. You know, you're day in, day out, you're pestering the patent officers, the trademark officers, whatever, with your kind of arguments, and you are shaping the law. You know, people always think law gets written, puts on the book, and that's it. It's all done and dusted. No, the law really gets written on a daily basis, how you actually participate in it. And I
Yeah.
think that the public is left completely out of it, despite the idea that it's a democratic system.
So let's kind of maybe we can sort of start at the beginning. Like, what are patents, and what are they what are they for?
So patents really are for people who invent things as that have a useful application. You can manufacture them, and it's the patents aren't for ideas, as often is commonly understood, but they're for actual genuine inventions, things that can actually be manufactured and scaled. So they have some industrial application, and so it's really rewarding the inventiveness of something. So it's actually something that has to be by the pillars of the standards that are used to grant a patent, or what we call the patentability test. Is it has to be something that's novel, that hasn't been published before. Now there are different rules in different countries as to what is deemed to be a publication, but just for general purposes, it's something that has to be published. And then it has to be something that is non-obvious, or in Europe we call it has to have an inventive step, something that takes it beyond what was already known, that wasn't obvious to somebody skilled in that field. And there are terms such as a person skilled in, or ordinary skilled in the art. These are very technical terms, but really what it means is somebody who works in that field and practices it. Now, it could be a team of people working in that field. It could be an individual. I think one thing that patent law mythically still tries to represent is that, there's this individual in a white coat kind of sitting under a microscope, kind of spending hours. No, there's teams of people, and it's
Yeah.
very different. And there's technology that is actually screening things. So actually, somebody's not actually doing anything. They're just sitting back waiting for the software to spit out some results. But we don't talk about that, And then we're getting into realms of AI, but that's a whole different discussion. And then you've got this thing in the US. It's called utility or industrial application, which really, actually, I think doesn't really function in its as a standard, because it basically many patents are granted which don't even show you any utility in when you file them. You're still in the early research phase. You don't know what the utility is, but it's a standard that doesn't get applied. And then there is a fourth one which I should have put before the utility one. Is actually you have to, and it's one of the social contracts of the patent system. You have to show that you're actually in grasp of the invention, actually really fully describe it in a written form, and you actually exemplify what it is that you're claiming. So at the end of the patent document, so you have two parts really: the description, which explains what the invention is and where the field was before you stepped in and how you've evolved it, and then basically the claims, which is really the metes and bounds of what your protection is. And so the written description rule is a big part of the social contract, because one of the main things of the patent system was that by publishing these inventions, people would then practice them once they expire. And so it's a way of diffusing information. But that's also a problematic thing, because people often don't describe them. They obfuscate and don't fully describe them, but the courts and the patent offices are not fully equipped to understand all that.
Well, I mean, the way that I understand the sort of history of I'm actually maybe you can educate me a little bit, because for many Americans, I think the beginning of patent history starts with the Constitution. There's a clause in the Constitution that says, I'm going to botch it, but for the advancement of the useful arts or something like that, right? The government can secure monopolies.
Yeah.
And is there a history that goes back before that? Were there other sort of patent, like, do you know where where does this idea come from, basically, that the government needs to secure monopolies on inventions in order to sort of advance the arts or technology? Like, I'm just curious about where that does that have some sort of historical origin that sheds light on how we got here?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there are various accounts of this, and I think and I will probably say limited, because there's probably far better historians of all this that have written stuff on there out there. But I think it was around in Venice was probably the first sort of origins of the patent system in the early days. I think there were things called letter patents, where I think monarchs would give these rights to certain individuals, usually people who were favored. And I think that became the sort of beginnings of a sort of system. And I really think it took hold more and more with some of philosophers, like, John Locke is probably cited as one of the, his reasoning on natural law and property, the second treatise of government is in every IP textbook, it pops up and it becomes the basis of the justification for property and intellectual property. I mean, I'm not going to go into it too deep here, but one of the things I find fascinating about a lot of the standard intellectual property texts, even from academics who, there's people who've written books like Justifying Intellectual Property, I think it's Robert Mergers. There's a whole chapter on John Locke and the theory of Locke and property.
Yeah.
And what's dramatically missing from this narrative is, John Locke actually, he was a member of the British government in some ways and advising. He was a known colonialist.
Right.
Supported taking property and of other people. Now, he justified it in other ways. And so when you look at what's in the actual Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 of the US Constitution, it's interesting that the word discovery is in there, which is very much relevant to how people were taking property or land of indigenous people.
Right.
And it's part of the language of the patent law today that, if you invent or discover, that's yours. And I think that is a huge gap in the discussion of around intellectual property. It's almost like, so this is a natural law. I don't think it is. Was
Right.
it a natural law to take, take somebody's land from someone?
Well, there's this interesting, we don't need to get
I
caught
know
up
I'm
on stuff,
diverging off in a
but
different direction.
I'm also interested in, you're going to have to pull me out of it a little bit because I think that there's there is kind of there is an interesting connection between Locke's way of thinking about property and intellectual property. And so, I mean, like the way that I understand Locke's kind of innovation is that it's not exactly, I mean, I'm just gonna walk into the meat grinder here and get all this wrong and upset people who have studied this stuff in depth. But like, it's not. I mean, what I think is interesting about Locke is it's not. He's not exactly saying that uh, that property rights arise from discovery. He has this idea of like mixing labor. It's this sort of so Locke's basic concept is that how does the original right to a parcel of land arise, right? So it's like we know, okay, like if you buy land, then you own it because you bought it, or if you inherited it, then it's because you inherited it. If you have property in something that you built, then you have property in it because you built it. But there's this kind of puzzle with like land that is like claimed or seized or something, right? Because those kinds of things, you didn't make it and you didn't receive it from someone who had a pre-existing just claim to it, right? So his idea is he has this idea of like mixing your labor. So in other words, someone who mixes their labor with the land by farming it or whatever, a property right arises in what you mixed your labor with. And that, there might be a prehistory of that too, but to me, that feels like something kind of new with Locke, because it's like, it's this idea that it's this sort of wedge into the system that enables you to start claiming property rights in things that you didn't completely make, and things that don't have a chain of title preceding your claim, right?
I think that's right. Yeah, no, and you're right to point that out regarding the mixing of your own labor into the whatever is already there. And I think in some ways that gets to the broader conversation, which I'm sure we'll touch on, is this idea of investment.
Right.
Um, but I mean, I guess what I was trying to say with the whole Locke thing is I just wish there would be a more sort of transparent discussion about the origins of that. rather than just talking about it that, here it is and this is how it works. There's a lot more behind there.
Right. Well, I mean, this is why I think there is a really interesting parallel between Locke and intellectual property, because patents. Um, so okay, we understand the distinction between ideas and inventions, right? Patents apply to inventions, not ideas. Nonetheless, let's be honest, they kind of look like ideas, right? They sort of look like sort of patterns that we discover in terms of how we can uh, you know, put one device together with another device and make a third device.
Yeah.
And so all these kinds of patterns, they don't really come from nowhere, right? They were already out there. And so there's this sort of puzzle about why, you know, the either the first person who does it, the first person who builds something, or the first person who thinks of a certain way of putting things together should have a legally protected property interest in that thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and it seems to me that the justification has always depended on what you were just alluding to, which is investment, investment of time or investment of money or investment of some kinds of resources in the in sort of coaxing out the invention from whatever, for coaxing out something new from what was already there.
Yeah.
Um, and um, I mean, maybe you can just. I guess I'm just curious to steelman it a little bit. Like, what is the argument for um um what's the argument for giving some kind of a legal monopoly to people who to people or corporations or groups of people who come up with a new invention?
Well, I think when we look at it in terms of at least what's written in the Constitution, let's just start from that premise. It's to incentivize, it's to get people to do creative pieces of work. I mean, in the Constitution at least, copyright is obviously mentioned, writings and what have you, and then inventions or discoveries are the other one, which is patents. Interestingly, trademarks and designs are not in the Constitution, but get wrapped up into the bigger intellectual property discourse. But I think ultimately it's about creating the incentive to invent, to progress the arts, science. It's all about progress, right? Is the idea is that you get rewarded with this monopoly that basically is time bound. But then once that time runs out, whatever that time is, I mean, but currently we're at 20 years from the date
Right.
of file patent. It used to be 14 years. Um, and then basically that's it. Goes into the public domain. Everyone can practice it. Everyone's better off. You've got your you've got your fair share of reward for your labor, for your mixing of, to use the lock thing. And here's your reward for it. And the world's better off, and there's some public utility, usefulness that comes out of it. Hopefully it gets commercialized. Sometimes people don't commercialize these things. They just sit on them. Not every patent actually has seen itself develop into something useful in the actual market. People just sit on them. People use them. I mean, today people use them for many different things to extract licenses. We've heard the term patent trolls. They don't actually produce anything. They just send letters and say, right, you're infringing my patent. So they're accumulating patents just to kind of get a rent. That's the more modern day version. Back, I guess, in the older days, it was really people maybe had the patent, but they just didn't have the investment to kind of develop it. So there's
Yeah.
many, because it was probably cheaper to get patent. And that's one of the arguments of the modern patent system. If you think about it, the US, the argument is that the US ushered in a modern patent system because they tried to democratize invention, so that it made it easier for people to come out and actually apply for a patent. Whereas maybe in some of the old versions of the patent system, the letters patent, where monarchs were giving it to certain favorable people that they wanted to give these rights to, and it wasn't really democratic. So
Right.
that's an argument that people have made about the patent system. But I feel, and again, we may get to this in the discussion, I feel today we're kind of back at a kind of feudal patent system because there's more and more knowledge being accumulated in the hands of a few. We still hear the odd stories about, the individual inventor. I think that's the kind of story that those who defend the patent system like to tell because it sounds good. But really, a lot of information is being sort of swallowed up by a lot fewer sort of entities. And it's kind of become very kind of sort of feudal in that sense. And I think it's only going to get worse.
I mean, it strikes me that two things strike me. One is that, if you look at the protections that patents give to inventors, they have limits, right? So what one limit is time. There are other limits like you were talking about before, like utility and obviousness and these kinds of things, which maybe we'll talk about. But this idea that the monopoly the government gives you has limits, kind of already admits that there's like a possibility of these protections going too far, right? So it's obvious in a way, right? That if a patent lasted for 100 years, that would be too long, and so it doesn't. It only lasts for 20 years. But the other thing that strikes me is just that particularly with respect to time, it feels so arbitrary, right? It's super clear, right, that 20 years is just a round number. It's not like pegged to any sort of analysis of like the justification for the length of the protection, right? It's just an amount of time. And I wonder if you think uh like when you think about the problems with patents, do you think that like are you do you believe it's a matter of sort of tweaking around the edges of these limits to make the patent protection system more reasonable, or do you think there is some kind of more fundamental rethink that is required?
It's a great question, and it's something that actually I'm about to embark on a residency next month where I'm going to spend time thinking about. Is it a reform or is it more reimagining or rethinking, as you say? And I think the way I look at it after spending 20 years of my life really being embedded in this work, the more I think about it, the more I think it needs a rethink. I think perhaps the idea of the patent system sounded wonderful, back in the 1800s and what have you, the early 1700s, late 1700s, and I think maybe, but today the business practices, the way it works, I think it's completely different today, and I think really it's serving to just be. It's like saying like, well, we don't want to think of another system. We need to keep the engine of the economy moving and what have you, and investment flowing. And I think really what the patent system has become is about investment. It's about giving somebody who's putting in some investment. And no one's denying that people invest in trying to bring products to market which are useful and what have you. But there is, I think the idea that it's all inventive is, I mean, we have the buzzword now, innovation, which I think is a hugely problematic term because I think, I was actually interestingly looking at the Google Ngram. And if you look at the terms invention and innovation, back in the late 1800s, for anybody who's not familiar with Ngram, it kind of tracks how words are used from various sort of things that Google has recorded. And it basically shows the word invention has gone down, whereas the word innovation has taken a surge up. But what's interesting, they connect around 1976.
Okay.
And the language of innovation just skyrockets, but the language of invention drops. Now, I have a theory about that. I think actually that's the neoliberal policies that drove that, about basically keeping the market growing, keeping the economy growing. I think a lot of obsolescence. How do you keep the same product and life cycles of the same product? And obsolescence is a term, a thing that's existed since the 30s, the motor industry were the pioneers of obsolescence. And so basically, I think that's crept into all different services. We see that with our iPhones, our technology. And the pharmaceutical industry has very much adopted that kind of principle. And I think that for me is actually, when I think of innovation, I think that, see, you've taken something that already exists, in that the knowledge, the invention part of it, and you've applied it. But you're not
Right.
really inventing anything. And I think that has muddied the whole system up so much that I don't think it is a patent system anymore. I know you probably heard me at the convening recently that we were at. I always love to quote a UK judge who I think is very well sort of regarded in the IP space, and he was a pro patent person. But I like to take his thinking a little bit further than he did. He wrote a seminal piece on what's invention got to do with it. He said a lot of things are obvious, by that standard, like what you get a patent for. He said why the patent system exists is because we need to incentivize the investment.
Right.
So
Yeah. And
and so
so,
for me,
so the idea is
it,
that innovation, the term innovation is a little bit of a sleight of hand that is,
exactly,
disguising the fact that what we used to call invention isn't really what's going on most of the time now.
exactly. I mean, you look at the history. I mean, this is something I'm writing about in my book. Is you look at the language, and just even taking that engram, and obviously that's just a very surface sort of example. But even like terms like incremental innovation started to appear around the 90s and maybe a little bit later.
Right.
And the pharmaceutical industry it rolls that out every time. They all use the innovation word every time anybody attacks the patent system. You're going to kill innovation. I'm like, well, the patent system wasn't really about innovation per se, but
Right.
economics language has changed as well over the years.
Right. It's like it's also you could also think of that as a shift between sort of discrete jumps to just sort of a continuous process.
A continuous process, a continuous life cycle of basically profiteering, of rent seeking, or whatever it is.
Right.
And I think that's why I think I fall on the side of we need a rethink.
Gotcha.
Again, I'm not concluding that rethink, but well, concluding that's my thought, but that's what I feel because when I look at the language and how the system's working, it's like basically to the point of obviousness. I mean, a lot of this knowledge already exists.
Right.
Sure, it's not exact science to reapply it to a different drug or a different compound or have you. You're going to get slightly different results. But we have in patent law an obvious to try test. It's what courts are supposed to apply to say, well, was it obvious to try that? Well, most things are obvious to try.
Right. So can you explain a little bit about how maybe you can explain a little bit about that standard and give examples of or your example or two about, like uh how it doesn't really get applied.
Right, yeah. I mean, for example, we have like in science, and again, it's going to get a little technical, so I'll try and pull it out of the weeds a little bit. For example, let's say you have a small molecule compound, organic chemistry. You got the compound structure, you know what it is, it has some certain properties. And then what you do is what companies do, pharmaceutical companies do, is what they'll do, they'll screen that compound because some of the properties may, if you want to produce it into a drug, they may be less stable in a certain form. So all small compounds, they have many different forms, they're called crystal forms. So basically what you do is you screen them in different ways to see what has the best pharmaco properties so that when you want to make a drug, it's stable, it's just not going to kind of lose its the active ingredient potency. Now, these kinds of techniques, you use high through screening input. So you have these machines or these softwares that basically just screen everything. It requires an individual, to read the readouts and the X-ray sort of readouts, what have you. And but to call that an invention, that's just inherent already in the original compound.
Right.
But the United States courts, at least, have never held anything like that obvious when it's litigated.
And why is that? Because, from I think from an outside point of view, you'd think, like if you just kind of read the black letter law about patents, it seems like it seems like this problem is addressed. There's this standard called obviousness, and if an invention is obvious, then you can't patent it. So, but then why doesn't that happen? Why don't people
So,
say that invention's obvious and then the patent's invalid?
so to be fair, what scientists will say and experts when they testify in these kinds of cases, and I have a great scientist who works with me on my team. One of the arguments that gets made, and this has been made throughout, is like they're unpredictable. You don't know what is going to happen. So that's why they're considered non-obvious. But the thing is that what we talked about, it's an obvious step to take.
Right.
You're going to screen for it. So it becomes non-obvious because you can't predict it, but you took the step because you know it's there. So you're just waiting for the results. So that's, I think, is where it gets why the courts allow it. Now, of course, the people who are testifying and the people who are the experts, they're all paid for by the corporations, and so they set the standard.
Right.
It's their bread and butter. They're getting paid $1,000 a day to be an expert. Then of course they're going to say it's unpredictable.
Right. I
I
mean,
mean,
and
I'm pushing the boundaries a little bit by saying that, but it's the way it works. There aren't any independent experts in these cases.
I mean, the other thing that maybe you can, shed a little bit of light on is like the um there's a major difference that people who don't think about this all the time might not be holding in mind, which is the difference between um getting something patented, getting a patent issued by the USPTO, and that patent being held valid in a court, right?
Very different.
So, um, and my impression is that the USPTO routinely issues patents to things that wouldn't hold up in a court if they were challenged, and that's even this is even before we get into the kinds of questions that you're talking about whether courts are upholding patents that they shouldn't be upholding, right? Even even short of that, there are patents that courts wouldn't uphold that are getting issued all the time, right? I mean, so that's my impression. Tell me if that's right or wrong in your view, and if so, why is that? Why is that? Why does that
Oh,
happen?
I think that's the right impression. I think, for example, there's a statistic out there. It's a colleague of mine, Bhavin Sampath, who wrote a piece in Science. Him and Scott Hemphill, they were looking at the when generics challenge pharmaceutical patents in the small molecule space. Um, not the primary patents, say the main compound, but the subsequent ones. The formulations, the other the things that extend the patent protection. 2/3 of those get invalidated when the companies don't settle. And that in itself is a pretty stark statistic. And I think when you look across all the other technology areas, the types of patents you see, the thing is to your point, is that the patent office, the incentives of the patent office are to grant. That's how it makes a lot of its revenue. It's a revenue user fee system. Examiners are there's a whole host of literature written out there. I think there's some great work by Melissa Wasserman and I think it's David Frakes who talk about the amount of time examiners have to examine a patent. I mean, anybody who's not read a patent, they can range from anything like 10 pages to 800 pages. And particularly in the pharmaceutical space, you're looking at thousands of compounds or molecular structures, gene sequences or sort of protein sequences. And to examine that in 19 hours, that's barely 2 working days.
Yeah.
And we're handing that power to the pharmaceutical company by granting a patent a right. And then, and I think this is where another significant rethink is needed. What we have is a system whereby basically, oh, well, we'll let the market fix it, i.e. the courts. So
Right.
you have these commercial actors who will then basically decide how they want to navigate when a competitor can enter. And that's when you have these settlement agreements because of all these patents that get stacked up. I mean, Humira, the AbbVie drug, is a great example of this. AbbVie is a sort of poster child for filing some more than 300 patent applications on a drug, a rheumatoid arthritis drug, and had several other uses. And they were able to, their main patent was supposed to expire 2016, but they've piled all these other what we call secondary type patents, subsequent different formulations, different methods of using the drug on different indications, all which are considered patent worthy in the current standards. And they were able to extract their protection out. The patent protection ran until about 2032, 34, if I remember. But because the companies couldn't litigate through all these, there was, they were these patents were thrown at them. The biosimilar company said, well, screw this, we'll just settle. And they ended up coming into the market 7 years later than the main patent. So that's 2000, beginning of 2023. And in that 7 year period, AbbVie earned to the tune of $114 billion. And who's paying for that? We are.
Right.
And what's even worse is, which people don't talk about, is all those extra patents that they filed as part of the settlement, the companies that entered are now giving royalties on those patents. Because when you're trying to work around them, you can't. So you say, well, I'm just going to pay rent to you. So not only are they extracting rent from the companies for that, they're also extracting 7 years of extra rent from us as payers.
And how big of a I guess there's two questions which kind of I feel like somehow need to be answered at the same time for an observer of this situation to kind of make up their mind about what's going on and what should happen. And I mean those two questions are, first of all, like, how big of a problem is this? Like how much of the, um issue of high pharmaceutical prices and high healthcare costs is caused by this? I mean, maybe if you can give like some sense of that. And and then the other question, which I think just sort of needs to follow right behind it, is how, if we didn't have these massive protections that we give to pharmaceutical companies, um, how how can we be sure, or how can we be confident, or how confident can we be that we will still get um, uh, progress, that we'll still get people investing in and working on and developing new uh, solutions to health problems?
Really, really, pertinent questions. I think on the first one, I think where we see these extra protections and these protections that get lengthened out. I mean, the AbbVie case that I was just talking about, when the main patent should have expired in 2016, they increased their price almost twofold in that 7 year extra protected period. And we've done some studies. There's a report that we did called the burden of patent thickets, where often it's in that extended period that they make most of their money.
And the reason that's interesting, I think, is because you can sort of, like, if basically the invention had already been made at that point, right? So there's kind of a, whatever significant progress in the medical sciences we're all benefiting from, by that point it had already been made. So there's kind of a clear argument for that extended period that whatever reward is going to the pharmaceutical company is not causing uh, additional sort of medical progress to get made.
Right, which is so that's a great point. So the argument that they would make, or the industry likes to make, is, well, we are hindering medical progress. We don't give those extended patents, because what they're saying is we're developing the existing invention. We're doing trials to bring, like, testing it for other indications, or we're trying to improve the product. And this is the innovation part. Because we've got a cash cow. We want to keep it. We want to get the life cycle. We want to extract every ounce out of it, which is the modern business model. I'm not going to go back to the drawing board and really reinvest top dollar to kind of come something new. I'm going to basically keep the gravy train going for as long as I can, because my shareholders are on my back, my CEO and deliverables are on the table. There's all the sort of financialized aspect of what the pharmaceutical industry has become. That's another discussion, but those are the motivations now. It's not about, let me bring out a better product, or let me go and I'm going to just keep improving the same product. It's the iPhone 15 or whatever number we're on. It's the same model, and basically, and I don't believe those are inventions. And by the if we can apply the strict wording invention, because doing clinical trials on a drug that you already know the mechanism of action, to your point that the progress has already been made by once you found the thing. Clinical trials, for me, at least the last I understood it, you're just following protocol to see how it works in patients. You're not inventing anything at that point. You were investing dollars, don't get me wrong, in clinical trials. Cost a lot of money. No one knows the exact figure. They cost a
Right.
lot of money. But that's a different thing. That's not an invention.
Right. So is there some kind of like weaker or more precise or more modulated form of protection that that the government needs to think about providing to incentivize that kind of investment?
Well, for that kind of investment, I think the market has to just do its job. You get your first mover advantage, you come up with a different indication. That's it. By the time someone's run those equivalent trials or whatever it is, even if they're abbreviated trials because generics and biosimilars don't have to do exactly the same trials, you've still got 2, 3 years of advantage. And the interesting thing in small molecule spaces, when you do these like new indications or what have you, you're getting an FDA exclusivity already.
Right.
You get 3 years. I mean, the thing is, the whole goal of the patent system now is how can I lengthen my protection? It's not about necessarily, for the way the kind of social contract works. And I think it's become a business tool.
Yeah.
So to your point of are we going to harm progress and think? Well, there's another part of that. A lot of the basic science, what they call the basic science, the upstream science, is often done in public funding and what
Right.
have you, and the corporations come in. So there's that aspect of it. I mean, I don't want to overstate it, but I also want to make sure it's noted. And so basically, even if you look at the COVID vaccines, a lot of the work was done at, I think it was University of Penn by academics. And then Moderna gets a lot of funding from BARDA and the Operation Warp Speed. So, there's a lot in the mix that
And
benefits the version.
and I think just another interesting observation is that, suppose you do very basic research that, unlocks the possibility for lots of medical progress or whatever. That basic research is not patentable, right? That's just research.
Well, basic research, no, but there's a lot of basic patents that, the upstream patents that become like maybe, it's the first kind of, you identify the first sort of beginnings of that biologic drug or what have you. And that's what everything develops from.
Right.
That's patented, but it's held by somebody else. And then the companies come in, they either acquire it, get a license, and then they basically commercialize it. And I'm not saying that commercializing it is some kind of easy thing, and it takes effort and time, but not to the tune of what we're giving in terms of rewards.
But I mean, I think what I'm getting at though is that, like, scientific discoveries, right, are not patentable. Okay. I mean, correct me if, is that correct?
Signed when you say scientific discovery, in what sense? Like a like an abstract principle?
Yeah. Yeah. So
Well,
like,
abstract stuff. Yeah, no, that's considered non-patentable subject matter, like a formula or something like that. Yeah.
yeah. Or if you discover a new, neural pathway or something like that, right? That's
Well, I mean, according to case law, if it's like, for example, you could have something that exists in nature and then you take it out of its nature and you add some like, mix your own labor with it, then it becomes patentable. It's like Diamond Chakrabarti kind of set that standard in the early 80s. Like,
right. But it's just and again, maybe I'm far from an expert in this, but I'm just kind of reasoning through it, right? So because it seems like a lot of in many cases, if you want to understand the genealogy of a medical breakthrough, right?
mm,
A lot of the investment might have gone into, might have been sort of upstream of the discovery of the basic abstract scientific stuff, as opposed to the investment that happened, between the scientific stuff and the invention, right?
I agree with that. I agree with that. And I think where the cost does come in the commercializing all the subsequent stages is the clinical trials point. That that's where I think a lot of the money gets spent. That's the development aspect of it. It's not the invention aspect of it, it's the development. It's like that's what you have to run to. And so, that's fair. The clinical trial stuff is expensive, but I think that's where we could think of other models where the government actually funds, they do fund some of these trials already.
Yeah.
And many of these new sort of uses of an existing drug are often born out of physicians just trying something out off label. And then drug companies pick up on it and they go, oh, right, we'll try that. And then they get more patents out of it. So really, they're not even really doing anything. They're just kind of just tracking what's going on in terms of the use.
So one other dimension of this that I have long been curious about is a lot of people are aware of the huge difference in drug costs in the United States versus the rest of the world. Like the same drugs are sold much cheaper in the rest of the world often. Um, does this have anything to do with that, or is that a separate problem?
I think there are other factors. For example, in Europe, at least if that's a comparison, it's an obvious comparison because it's the industrial global north. It's a negotiation of prices. There's a lot of government negotiation. I think that's a big factor. Certain um, health agencies, for example, the UK, they have the agency called NICE. They basically will look at whether an existing drug is actually a new drug is going to basically offer any more advantage than the existing drug, and if it doesn't really, then we're not going to pay that new price for it. So then this becomes an argument vis-a-vis patients in the US, or an argument the industry likes to make that has, I think, actually crept into society, is that, oh, well, if you have governments intervening like that, you're taking away our freedom of the choice of the drug that we want. This is why we have, the US is apart from New Zealand, the only country that has direct to consumer advertising of pharmaceutical drugs.
Right.
Because, you see it and you say, well, you go to your doctor and you say, I want that. And basically, if like a system like in the UK where they say, well, it's not adding any value and we're not paying that price for it or whatever, because they do subsidize some of it, then people say, well, that you're taking away my freedom, which I always say, that's kind of weird because if you can't afford it, where's your freedom?
Right.
It's perverse. It's kind of weird. But yeah, I think negotiation is a big factor. But I do think patents do play a role because many of the drugs I was talking about, or we've done in our studies, we found that earlier entry of competition in Europe has brought the price down. But yet we are still paying max price because of the patents. So the patent games do extend out. And by no means am I saying solving the patent problem is going to solve all the drug pricing problem,
Right.
but it's a big part of it. It's a root of it because in a way, all the incentives flow from the patent system. Is like basically, why am I going to go and really go back to the lab and start developing another groundbreaking drug when I can keep milking the cow that I have that I know is so profitable?
Do you still see big price differences internationally with generic drugs?
No, not so much on the generic side. I mean, it's not something that I've really studied, but I don't think there's a dramatic difference. I think once things get onto the market here in generic form and you get maybe 4 or 5 entrants, I think FDA has done studies which show that prices drop like by 90%. So I think it becomes very competitive at that point, and in a way, almost too competitive. Because the opposite problem, the competition problem, you kind of people leaving the field because it's just not worthwhile for them. So that's a balance you have to get. And so, but no, I don't think the generics in the in the Europe are probably they're probably roughly the same price.
Gotcha. Yeah.
It's an interesting study point which I haven't actually seen, but at least on what I've seen, it's not that different.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I think
Um,
where you might see a difference is biosimilars, because I think biosimilars here operate in a different regulatory environment than in Europe. Because here you have this whole thing where you have to show it's interchangeable, and that's a regulatory requirement. And certain states don't allow that. So basically, formularies and what have you, this is where the American healthcare system or drug pricing system is so convoluted, and you've got so many actors who are just literally skimming off it. Uh, Whereas in Europe, you don't have that issue. And so basically, on the biosimilars side, I think prices drop much more quickly than over here when competition comes in.
gotcha.
That might be, yeah, that's the difference where it might be.
And so what are the, you know, handful of reforms that you think could be made either to the patent system, to the USPTO, or to like legal patent doctrine itself? I mean, what are the I know you have a handful of concrete ideas that you think could mitigate the issue, and love to hear what they are.
Yeah, we put out a blueprint, I think it was the end of last year, where we touch on some of the key areas that we think need to happen. I think one of the basics starting points is, and this sounds, it doesn't change the sort of, it's not reform in any form, but it's actually allowing yourself to have a more transparent system. I think drug companies, pharmaceutical companies, they have to provide certain patent information for the regulatory purposes. There's the US FDA Orange Book, and there's the Purple Book for biologics, and whenever whenever you may get a drug approved, you're the originator company, you get a drug approved, you have to show which patents you will use to defend that particular product. And the biologics is a bit different, but it's a similar concept. You don't have to list all your patents. You just have to list the ones that you think you're according to what the statute requires. But the problem with that is like there's a whole plethora of other patents that they have. I mean, we do these, we landscape all these, we look at those never get known. So what we're doing is we're kind of operating policy in the dark. So basically, a lot of policymakers, they don't know what's going on because people think, oh well, it's just the patents that are litigated that matter. No, you file patents, and I know this from practice. You file a whole array of things to set all these traps so that your competitors have to navigate through them, like they're like landmines. And basically, the longer time they spend trying to work around something, the less time they're not going to come to market sooner. Now, of course, there's a period of time where you can't come to market anyway because the FDA gives a particular market exclusivity that no one else can compete with, and you can't even challenge that. So it's like 5 years or 12 years for biologics, 5 years for small molecules. Though that period is like sacrosanct, you can't touch that. But then after that, it's like basically you're just trying to get your drug onto market, and then you're going to get embroiled in litigation. So having stacks of patents helps. Even patents you're not even going to litigate helps because what you're doing is you're kind of like, if I want to formulate it a different way and I've already patented all those different routes, you're kind of like, oh well, my opportunity is shrinking. So that, I think, actually even just having basic transparency, like drug companies should actually have to show all the patents they have in their portfolio on a drug, because what that would show people is how problematic the whole thing is. We've tried to do this with our databases, and we've had pushback because people are saying our data's flawed, our this and that. And what we find actually is we're not even actually finding all the patents. We're only finding quite a comprehensive amount, but not all of them. So I think starting from that point, because then people can see how problematic and how out of hand this whole system has become. It's kind of become unwieldy. That would be basic, number one. We need to know what we're actually talking about in terms of policy. I think it also just goes to show, it goes against that narrative of what the USPTO does. Like, oh, the more patents, the more innovation. Not necessarily. I think it's an absurd measurement and it should be stopped. And then secondly, I think these like follow-on patents that come after the main one, I think a lot of these aren't inventions in the strict term. They're just life cycle management techniques to kind of keep extracting out. I think all those should go, so we wouldn't have a problem like we have with AbbVie, right? And that's happening in every sector and every type of company. That would actually at least prevent sort of overpaying for 5, 6, 7 extra years, whatever it is. I think it would also prevent settlements. We'd have different generics, and biologics would start operating differently because they don't mind a settlement. They don't pay 2 billion to stay off the market or whatever, but they would have to change their strike. So what you're doing is you're changing the entire environment.
Right.
I think also in the biologics space, without getting too technical, a lot of companies, and it's a similar problem as I was already mentioning, companies will patent as many different ways of making the biologic, so that in the biologic space, because it's much more precise, it takes away any opportunity for someone to work around it. And so what they do is, even if they're not using those manufacturing process patents, they still assert them. I think there should be a rule that after your 12-year FDA exclusivity, if you have decided not to use that manufacturing process patent, you lose it. It's subject to cancellation. And I think it's kind of a use it or lose it sort of principle. You've got 12 years to figure out which is your best method of production pattern. And if you don't use it, you can't just assert it just to block someone and get a license rental. I think that's what's holding up a lot of things. And I think it's actually against the essence of the patent system. I think that's anti-competitive.
One thing that really strikes me is, if you there's maybe you can say a little bit more about the international dimension of it, because it seems to me that one of the challenges in terms of getting these getting, I don't know, politicians and the public to sort of buy these arguments is that it's hard to show the counterfactual, right? It's hard to show, for example, that if we didn't have all of these whole thickets of patent protections, that innovation would be the same or better even, right? Are there other, I mean, maybe you can just give a little bit of a flavor of the sort of international IP regime and kind of answer the question of like, are there other jurisdictions out there that have a more reasonable, shorter periods of protection or something like that that we can point to and say, like, look, I mean, if we change the system in such and such a way, it would be fine because it works there, or is there, or do we just lack those points of comparison?
We unfortunately don't have that, and that's the hard part, the counterfactual, and even globally, because the system has been in many ways harmonized through the World Trade Organization. That was the effort that the pharmaceutical industry, as well as the copyright industries, led in the late 70s, early 80s. They pushed for this. It was a kind of and also a lot of neoliberal economists and architects, they felt post decolonization, these countries would start becoming competitors in the market, and they started pushing for a rule of law framing that would make it seem like, this is what's fair, and that's again the trading system. So all those places, all those countries where we might have had counterfactuals have slowly started sort of being sucked up into the same system. Now, the other thing is also there's a lot of other moving pieces. For example, people might say, well, India didn't have, for example, patent laws from 1970. It repealed, or at least on pharmaceutical products, from 1970 until 2005, once it reconnected with the World Trade Organization. People say, well, there wasn't much, true invention coming out of India. Well, India was still a developing country coming through, and it also doesn't have the NIH spending nearly, probably the most research money of any, scientific enterprise. In fact, that's what drives a lot. It's an industrial policy as well. So I think it's kind of it's a bit of a chicken and egg in the sense of, I think, pharmaceutical companies keep hold of the power. They keep making all the revenue. They stay hold of the power and the investment money. And so therefore they can keep churning it out. But you're not letting anyone else develop that investment capital.
Yeah,
And so it's kind of actually, I think the economists have got it all wrong in that sense. They say, well, have an IP system, you'll get more technology and you'll have more innovation, quote unquote. Well, no, you need to give them a free space to be able to develop the capital to kind of be competing in the market, because the pharmaceutical industry don't want that, because that's how they get all their capital to reinvest.
right,
And that's the absurdity of the system. So we don't have that because they won't let that happen.
right. Do you see, do you think that these problems are unique to pharmaceuticals, or especially bad with pharmaceuticals, or do you view these problems as applying to other areas of, technology and industry too?
I think it's applicable to a lot of different areas. I mean, software has its own sort of they all have their own unique features. I'm not an expert on all of them. I know people I speak to in the technology sector, the software sector. I mean, it's even more rampant. The industry, the pharmaceutical industry, when we have these discussions, they like to say, well, we don't actually have that many patents when you compare it to, the 200,000 patents that the iPhone has or whatever it is.
Mhm.
I'm like, that's an absurd argument. That means all those 200,000 patents are crap as well. What a terrible argument to make.
Right,
You're just like basically, well, they're worse than me. It's like, but I just want to deflect it, and that's the argument they make. But the whole patent system is corroded. It's I hear from software lawyers who basically say, we're just basically filing these patents just for defensive purposes. We're just trying to gain some ground. It's a battle. It's this hidden battle that's going on between enterprises,
right.
and I need to have more, sort of armory in my pocket or in my gun or whatever it is, so I can fight these battles, so I can get some leverage on it. And that's all it is. That's what the patent system has become.
But if you, I mean, it's, I guess if you frame it that way, like, we're just filing these patents for defense purposes, that almost makes it sound like, oh, it's no big deal. It doesn't have any big consequences, right? Because it's just, you know, the I mean, I think that what I sometimes struggle with is uh you know, the difficulty of drawing a line between the problem that you're describing and the, very real consequences in people's lives.
Well, I mean, the consequences, I mean, we don't see them, but when you start looking at it, at least in the pharmaceutical space, I mean, if you look at, if they acquire all this land, if you want to call it like land,
Right.
you're basically preventing anybody researching in that area. And then
Right.
basically you're at the whim of that one particular company or a few particular companies who are battling in that space, and nobody else can get in. So basically, in a way, I think the patent system is, in that sense, anti-competitive.
Right. And I mean, I guess it's a, this is farther outside your bailiwick, but I'm just very curious if, it's something, if similar sort of phenomena are happening in, let's say computer hardware or things like that, right? I mean, I wonder if the thickets of patents around, you know, uh, microprocessors or things like that are preventing uh progress being made around the margins by upstarts, by people and organizations that are outside of the establishment, so to speak.
I don't have direct evidence in terms of, like, let's say the phone industry or whatever. I
Yeah.
mean, I know, Samsung and Apple have had a huge battles, fighting these things out, and but I imagine I would be surprised if it wasn't preventing other entrants coming in, because they're cornered off so much, and they obviously want, the more powerful you become, it's easier to maintain that power, by having access to all these kind of instruments that you can keep filing and doing. Certainly in the pharmaceutical space, I think we're seeing more and more consolidation. And I think we're seeing that in other spaces as well. And I think the patent system adds to that consolidation, or that ability to consolidate. And any even in the biotech industry, small companies that might actually be doing real good upstream research, they get acquired. So there's really, it's everything's getting sort of sucked into the same space.
Mhm.
And then few. I mean, people talk about choice and freedom. I think we're having less and less of that because of the way the system's working. Because it's very hard to compete in that space. I mean, industry likes to say, well, there is competition. The patent system evokes competition. Well, they're saying there's competition with two or three branded companies who can sort of price it at the top. They kind of start with shadow pricing, and they decide what the market looks like. That's not competition in my mind. I mean, if it is to some other people, then good luck.
Right. Do you want to shift gears and talk a little bit about trademark?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a topic that doesn't gets less discussed in these kind of realms.
Yeah. So you and I have had some great conversations about trademark over the past couple of months. So for those listening, this is a little bit, us kind of working out ideas here. But I think there really is something interesting here, because as you say, um, uh, there's all kinds of conversation out there. There's these three branches of intellectual property law, classically, right? Copyright, patent, trademark. And copyright and patent are heavily scrutinized, right? I mean, there's a lot of maybe copyright more than patent, which is why your work is so important. But uh, but it seems like there's very little kind of critical attention on trademark doctrine, which is, first of all, just kind of interesting, right? That it seems to uh, escape notice in a way, right? But there actually is something quite interesting and worth questioning about whether uh, our legal protections of trademarks are accomplishing what we would want them to do. Um, so do you want to say a few words, or should I do a bit more kind of setting up the idea here?
I mean, I would love to, because actually, I mean, this is, in all fairness, this was an idea that you had raised with me because we were talking about patents in somewhere, and you kind of, sort of try to apply something similar to trademarks, and it was fascinating. So, I mean, this is really, it's kind of burst by you in some ways with your thinking, which I think is fascinating, because in my prior life as a corporate attorney, I spent a lot of time with trademarks, and so I feel I've always had a sort of an interest in the trademark stuff, because it doesn't get the focus that it deserves. And I think the issue you raise is critical to kind of unpack.
Okay, cool. So I think the best way of starting is just by saying that, like, in the same way that we can look at patents and say that they have this ostensible public purpose of incentivizing invention and progress. there's this ostensible public purpose to trademarks as well, right? Trademarks are the basic what one of the basic ideas of trademark law is that we protect trademarks so that consumers aren't able to get confused. So, for example, if I'm selling a product under a certain brand, I have the right to protect that brand against a competing business who would sell their product under the same brand or under a confusingly similar brand. So this is why we don't have you know knockoff Coca-Colas with white and red cans that or that kind of a thing, right? Um, the um, uh, and on the surface, that seems like that kind of protection. So okay, I guess 2 points. One is that the first thing trademark is doing is trying to mitigate confusion. The other thing it's doing is protecting, just like patent, investment in a brand, investment in trademark, right? And from a sort of a critical point of view, you might say that's the main thing that trademark law is trying to do. It's trying to protect, the investments that people are making in businesses. But if it isn't also doing something for consumers, then there's no reason why the law should be protecting those investments, basically. So it kind of begs the question, where we need to ground the justification of trademark in some usefulness for consumers if we're going to be able to argue that we should be protecting these kinds of investments. And I think the main thing to notice is just that um, if what trademarks are supposed to reduce confusion for consumers, but they aren't necessarily always doing that. They can be used as a sword as well as a shield. They can be used to confuse consumers. And one way that they might be used to confuse consumers is, for example, by kind of like breaking the implicit promise that the trademark is making. So a concrete way that this could work would be that if I buy if I'm an investor or whatever, I buy a well-known brand and I reduce the quality of the product uh, while keeping the price the same. Um, there will be a certain now after a while the market will catch up. The market will realize that the quality of the product has gone down, so Coca-Cola isn't what it used to be, and the market will move away from the product. But when you have a very, very strong brand, the lag will be longer. The sort of time that it will take the market to react to a reduction in quality will be longer. So in other words, um, there's kind of a way in which the value of a brand measures the potential for using that brand to confuse the market. If I've got a brand that is so rock solid that people aren't going to move away from it for years, even after I, completely gut the underlying product quality, that's a that's a very, very valuable brand. That's a brand that a private equity company would love to buy, right? Because then they could do precisely that and take products in the time that it takes take profits in the time that it takes the market to realize that the product quality has changed.
I mean, I think in our sort of earlier conversations offline, I think you said, the mining the brand, right? Extracting from it. And sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you if you
No,
hadn't
no, no.
finished.
Please.
I think it's something that I've thought about not in the way you thought about it, because when I buy something and it's of a particular brand and I look at where it's made, for example, and a lot of those brands, at least a lot of the older ones, are built upon this idea, this prestige of that they're either made in America or they're made in the United Kingdom.
Right.
And today they're made in China or they're made in wherever it might be, Romania or whatever, because they want to labor's cheaper. And also, I think the quality of the cloth is different as well. They're even mixing cloth these days. I mean, people might call that innovation,
Right.
right? I mean, for example, just an example, you could buy maybe some. Look at Burberry, for example. It's a British brand, well renowned. They don't make in the UK anymore.
Right. Right.
They mix their materials. Nothing's 100% wool anymore.
Yeah. And I think that, I mean, this raises really interesting questions, right? It raises these questions about what are people buying? What do people think they're buying when they decide to buy something with a particular brand, right? And one argument you could make is that, you know, um, no, as we just were saying, you can reduce the product quality. Burberry could reduce the quality of the wool and continue to sell it at this the similar price for a long time because it's a very, very strong brand. Um, Even if they didn't do that, right? Even if they didn't, they could make a product in a different country so that it's not really like as much of a British product as the as it was historically. Now that raises this question of like, why are people buying it? Are people buying it just because of the sort of material fact of the nature of the wool and the plaid or whatever, or are people buying it because they are buying the idea of Britishness, or because they want to support a British enterprise or something like that. Right? So I mean, the way that it seems to me is that behind every brand is a quite complex mixture of sort of representations and promises and sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit assertions about about what this is. And when you own a brand, you basically have, you know, totally free reign to uh, to change the facts behind the brand, to change to alter the reality behind those implicit promises. And when you do that, there's a very real, very obvious, very simple way in which you are confusing the consumer, um, which cuts against the basic justification for trademark. And it just strikes me that um, uh, that this is kind of an under-examined way of looking at it, first of all. And second, uh, if we look at it that way, if we conclude that this is a real problem, that, there's, a real sort of confusion going on here, it's striking to me how the magnitude of that, because an enormous part of the economy is building brand equity, right? And when you build brand equity, you're building up these kinds of, complexes of promises, which are abusable and can be broken. And uh, I mean, the way that it shakes out to me basically is that I think that if companies are kind of holding to those promises behind a brand, there's nothing wrong with it. Then it does deserves protection, right? Um, but uh, clearly that's not always the case, right? I mean, the world is absolutely littered with brands that have been sold to a private equity company, or bought by a new investor group, or taken over by new management, which are profiting off of some kind of historical idea of what they were, um, even though that's really not what they are now. And so there's just kind of tons and tons of money and being made on the basis of this kind of confusion. It just seems to me that as a society, why should our governments protect that kind of enterprise, right? Why should they? I don't know.
Yeah, I think I mean I think there are a couple of things. I think one, it shows just a bit like well, a lot like the patent system. It's the trademark system is out of date, given
Yeah.
the business practices. I think that ultimately I think that's relevant to both because the way these tools are used are very different from what they might have been 100 years ago, 50 years ago, what have you. You know, the world has changed and it will keep changing. And to your point of, private equity firms or big brand houses just accumulating brands and just sucking them up and maybe just extracting whatever they can out of them, but not really maintaining the sort of prestige of what the original feature of the brand was. I think more and more that is the case with a lot of brands. I mean, I'm a consumer, you're a consumer. I think there's a lot of stuff that is not what it used to be, and I'm old enough to say that, sadly.
Right.
And I think then that becomes a confusion thing. People might argue, well, it's still the goodwill of the company. It's still got they're still using the sort of heritage of the company. They still probably try and implicate, in their manufacturing or whatever it is, keep to those principles. We don't know that.
They're not obligated to.
They're not obligated. And I think, it raises a question, and maybe, if you, I don't know if you agree with it. I think, does that mean then we have to build in a sort of an obligation or a transparency system? It's like for consumers, like, branding has to come with all these kinds of sort of well, different kinds of guarantees that, this is what's actually, what it means vis-a-vis the heritage of the brand, if you want to call it that.
Well, I think this is where it parallels patent. This is why it is kind of to me closely connected to your way of thinking about patents because um uh um it seems to me that what we need is just a more sensitive system. So, we need sort of a clearer idea of what values or what social goals intellectual property protections are trying to uphold. And then we need and on the basis of those kinds of clear ideas, we need to have systems that are supple so that they ensure that they aren't, just basically operating to facilitate rent seeking and profiteering when they have exceeded, when they are no longer protecting those goals. So, for uh, like the classic like libertarian argument for trademark is that it reduces consumer search costs. It's easier to find the product that you're looking for uh, as a result of the fact that trademarks are protected. And it's not just about sort of prestige brands that need to uphold a certain standard. I mean, there are also budget brands and brands that are just targeting a certain niche in the market or whatever. But increasingly, and so that kind of makes sense, right? That there's this whole kind of semiotic world out there that consumers are navigating largely through advertising, by the way. So this whole question about trademark really cuts to the core of like the entire advertising industry. But
Yeah.
but um the fact that a product can come out that serves some niche that is different from other kinds of products and it can represent itself through a brand, that representation of it through a brand does help people find that niche product, that product that is in some relevant way different from the other products. That reduces confusion. But I think we're just increasingly today in a world in which the confusion often runs the other way. The confusion is like the confusing question now is like, should you buy the brand name Dijon mustard or the store brand Dijon mustard, essentially, right? And and or should you buy the generic nameless Amazon thing from a factory in China, or should you buy the brand name electronics? You know, um the 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 representative content of brands is today confusing us in the direction of supporting the brand as often as it's clarifying the offering for the consumer.
I think yeah, no, that's a succinct way of putting it. It's and it is doing that. I just think we just don't see enough of it. We hear about it in a maybe specific exploration. I mean, even in the pharmaceutical industry, there's a different way of looking at it. The generic brands are solid because they're saying it's not the original.
Right.
It's the same active ingredient, and the pharmaceutical industry has done a remarkable job of basically getting people afraid of generics or cheap, affordable versions. Just imagine, even do the exercise yourself. You go to your pharmacy, you see the Walgreens version and you see the branded version. Psychologically, I think these are very different products because the brand has painted this picture. I mean, in some cases in the pharmaceutical space, and again, I don't want to overstate something because it might seem a little dramatic, but I've spoken to people, you hear all these talks about, oh, Indian generic drugs are very bad and what have you. And of course, there are problems. There are batch problems. There are manufacturing problems. Even some of the bigger pharmaceutical industries have had that issue. So it's always funny how it's always the other generic company who's got the problems. But what is interesting, some of the active ingredients, the kind of raw materials, often come from China or India. The same branded companies are using the same, but we don't know that. They don't tell you that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's the same with all kinds of of products. It's true in the food industry, in the beverage industry, in the clothing industry. I mean, I think people who know these industries know well that you've often got factories or um, bottling plants and one somewhere that are doing certain runs of product that are branded for a company, and then the exact same product and selling it under a generic name somewhere else, right? So
Yeah, I mean, I know transparency never resolves these problems, but I think there needs to be definitely a more, they have to meet certain standards because I think it comes really down to also the way the business world works today. And I think there's this, the same with the patent system, those who defend the patent system, it's almost like you can't mess with the golden child.
right.
And it's an older system. Like say anything, you've got to look at it where it is today and what's happening. And we're still applying the same 200-year-old, 300-year-old rules to a business practice that has evolved and become so profit oriented, extraction oriented, that it'll do anything to maintain this idea, this notion that everything's the same still as it was. And that for me is hugely problematic with these systems.
Yeah, I obviously agree, and I think we're in sort of an interesting moment where I think we have an opportunity, and I think kind of um, an important opportunity to rethink the way that we're doing a lot of these things. Um, and I also think that as we rethink these big social structures like intellectual property, it doesn't necessarily have to be about completely tearing everything up and starting over. I mean, there's a smarter way of doing this, I think, which is thinking about the principles, thinking about the underlying principles behind these systems that were set up a long time ago. And sometimes the basic principles need to be questioned too. That's the case. But a lot of times the basic principles are valid. And what we need to do is just understand the difference between the particulars of uh, how these institutions and structures and legal rules are being administered today, and the principles that they're supposed to be protecting.
Yeah,
And
and
yeah,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Yeah, we say, at least in the patent say, we say we have to bring the integrity back to what were
right.
the original principles. And I think the market forces and the actors, the Wall Streets or whatever, they want to break all those principles because they want to get whatever they can out of it. And that's not always beneficial to the public. I think rarely beneficial. So yeah, I fundamentally agree.
Yeah. Well, this was great. I think it's a
Yeah.
great place to close. Thanks so much for the conversation, and more to come.
Yeah, loved it. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it, Matt.